Hi class, welcome to chapter 4, the community food environment and prepared foods. This chapter is actually really important, and I also hope you sit back and realize how important it is for your own life, because a lot of what we're talking about in this chapter is really governing how 90% of you probably eat. And so one of the things that we have to address from a public health standpoint is how that food environment affects our overall morbidities. And what's a morbidity? A morbidity is a disease that could lead to a mortality, right? So morbidities could be probably anything with metabolic syndrome, right? Diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, all of those good things that are not good. So one of the things we do is we have to look at the structure of environment and see how that influences our food choices, because if we understand the structure of the environment and the influence on our food choices, well, then we know the types of policies we need to create in order to help prevent the public from getting sick, right? And those morbidities are what are making us sick. What we find in looking at this, we have to also discuss what's available in our foods, and that's two types of things. That's our prepared foods, and you'll see that in your textbook as PF. Our foods away from home, those are pretty interchangeable because whether it's being cooked by fast food or we're buying it prepackaged in a grocery store, these are all prepared foods, and prepared foods are simply less healthy, typically full of preservatives and higher in fat, higher in sugar, and all of that. And then we can target our population. And so there are two things you're going to study in this chapter a lot of, and that's food deserts and food swamps. They can exist in the same place at the same time, but not always. In Idaho, particularly, food deserts are definitely prevalent because we have a lot of rural community. For a long time, the Nampa main campus was a food desert. There was no access to anything fresh if you went to campus that day, because what the definition of a food desert is, there may be access to food, but there's no access to fresh food within a mile or two radius. And so therefore, if you are a lower income status and you can't drive to go get fresh food, it has to be walkable. And so what we see is they're prevalent in rural areas. They can also be pretty prevalent in urban areas where we see a lot of food swamps. Food swamps are where we're just inundated with high calorically dense food, low nutrient density, and lots of it. Actually, that image on outside your weekly folder this week is a perfect example of a food swamp. And what we see out of both of these, and particularly with food swamps, that morbidities are higher, obesity is higher, type 2 diabetes is higher, and then therefore cardiovascular disease and those other metabolic syndrome aspects are always higher in food deserts because people are predominantly getting their food from this high energy dense food, really low in nutrients, really bad for us, right? And so the bad news is when we look at inequities between income status, one of the things we see is this is very associated with low income status. And so foods that are available to lower income status because of the environment with which they live. Okay, it's not just the personal choice of what they're buying, it's what they also have access to. They tend to eat more sugar, more fat, less fruit, less vegetables, less healthy fish. And then therefore they seem to also have vitamin deficiencies. In the South right now, so scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency. Scurvy has been eradicated and has been for hundreds of years. And yet we started to see it in the South. And why were we seeing it in the South? Because you only find vitamin C in fresh fruits. So things like bell pepper, oranges, those types of fruits and vegetables. And so what we're finding is in the South, they're not eating them. And so they started to see symptoms of scurvy. One of the things we can do is we can do a market basket analysis and kind of look at the quality of food and the disparities in the environment, so therefore we can either put money towards or policy towards rectifying those environments. So what do we know? We know exactly what you already know. The more food you eat away from home, the more junk you're eating. So the higher the food is going to be in portions, in calories, in sugar, in fat. What we also know is the more food you typically eat away from home, you tend to be moving less. And so it's definitely associated with hypokinetic behavior. And more foods away from home are also linked to lower income status, which is really interesting. And one of the things I really want to challenge you to think about when it comes to this is something I hear a lot is, well, if they just made healthy food cheaper. You can't get stuck in that rhetoric because there's a couple things about that rhetoric. It's not completely honest. We can't ask a farmer to farm his land and then not make money. That's not reasonable. He also has a family to feed. And so we can't just say, well, you're price gouging because that apple's $1. Well, no, it actually might take that dollar to produce that apple. But are there other things that we can do? But is there a thing the population has control over as well? And so part of that with public health is we have to look at, okay, well, so how do you empower someone who has a lower economic status, who maybe is not going and buying fresh salmon every week, to also buy foods within their financial means, because they are available. There's a lot of healthy food that's completely financially available if you're a lower income, but you have to learn that, and you have to learn how to cook that kind of food. And you have to also be willing to prep your own food, because guess what? Healthy food doesn't come prepackaged. It's really not the way it works. And so part of that process is A, how do you educate, but then also how do you understand the demographics? Because if you don't understand the population that you're working with, gave you that AIDS reference last lecture, then you're going to have a really hard time understanding how to educate the current population. And so some of the things that we see particularly is there is a demographic risk factor. Hispanic and African American of the highest risk factors. And then we also see women, especially women of lower economic status, because they have no education. And so these are some of our target points that we can hit. Type 2 diabetes. So I just want to point out to you really quick. So type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset. Why was it called adult onset? Because it only happened as you aged. Now type 2 diabetes has really changed. A significant portion of our children have type 2 diabetes, and it is certainly a risk factor. And then something I wanted to show you, pull up right here, is that the prevalence. So now what are we beginning to see? 1.5 million Americans are diagnosed with diabetes every year. 27% of the senior population already has type 2 diabetes. 34.2 million adults are undiagnosed today. I will bet you in this class of about 50 students, I'll bet you at least 20 people in our class now are pre-diabetic or diabetic. And it used to be believed it was just in adults, but we look at youth. 210,000 Americans under the age of 20 are diagnosed with diabetes. This is solely the result of diet. This is the result of nothing else but not moving and choosing to eat bad foods. Also, there is a race breakdown. Brian is actually knows a lot about this because he studied this when he was getting his graduate degree about Hispanics and diabetes, and we find it very, very prevalent. But what's actually interesting now, when we look at race, is Asian Americans are beating out Hispanics. And so a lot of this, you kind of think, and now we think of the breakdown, you think of a breakdown of Asian Americans, Filipinos, Asian Indians are the highest. Well, they also have the poorest diets. You're not seeing Japanese necessarily on here. Okay, so this is just something to keep in mind, that there is a strong correlation between the culture that with you're raised, how your genetics are going to respond to that culture, and the foods you eat. Okay, so we went over that. We know that a lack of physical activity is also going to be a contributing factor. And then we look at as we age, and then we look at minorities. What are they linked to? Higher consumptions of sugars and fats, fewer consumptions of grains and vegetables and fiber, and fast food consumption. Okay, so cardiovascular disease, which is our other key non-communicable disease that we've been studying in this class, directly linked to this prepared food environment, right? So high sodium foods, high calorie foods. If you're African American, we're actually going to study this a little bit later, but the African American population has a much significantly higher risk factor for hypertension And so they are particularly sensitive to high sodium foods. And then we also see how dyslipidemia occurs. And the other thing I wanted to show you as I pull this up here is a lot of times when people think of cholesterol, they are thinking of fat. Well, what we know about LDL cholesterol, we have two kinds, right? We have HDL, which is the good stuff. We have LDL, which is the bad stuff. There are two types of LDL. There's pattern A LDL and pattern B LDL. So pattern A is big and buoyant and fluffy. Pattern B is small and dense. It turns out that pattern B is much more dangerous for us than pattern A because the small dents really can innervate the inner lining of our arterial walls and cause damage. That damage is what eventually will lead to atherosclerosis and running the risk of a stroke, coronary blockages, and such. Pattern B LDL largely comes from sugar consumption. And what I mean about sugar consumption, I don't mean the apple that you're eating, I'm talking about the added sugar in your diet. And so what we're seeing now, why sugar is getting, one of the reasons sugar is getting so much attention is that we now know it's a significant contributor to cardiovascular disease, and that's the number one killer of us. And so it turns out that yes, fat raises your large LDL, but this buoyant LDL causes less damage if the damage causing components aren't there. They kind of bounce around. Now, can they clog your arteries? Yes, totally. But they're less damaging. So that's actually one thing to consider. Now, the LDL stuff will not be on your exam, but I think it's important to know because we got really confused a while ago and we started thinking sugar was the solution to our fat. Sugar is now killing us and it didn't solve our fat. We got sicker even though our fat consumption went down over the last 30 years. And largely that's due to the amount of sugar that we eat. Okay, so there are a couple tools available to assess your nutritional environment, and really these are to assess a population's nutritional environment to help develop some of those policies and preventions. I want you to look into these two environmental measure surveys so you can understand that when we use these surveys, the type of data that we're going to receive as the result of their utilization, and then the validity and reliability when it comes to that. So ideally, we can use these surveys to collect baseline information and then change information for different populations. And what they've actually found, kind of like we've been discussing, is foods away from home, prepared foods, always have fewer healthy choices because fresh foods are not prepared foods for the large part. The other thing I want you to look at is kind of now, so we know about food deserts and we know about diet quality assessments. So take a look at the data presented in your textbook on how these have been applied to assess food environments so we can then make those determinations. So one of the things you're actually going to do this week is you are going to develop a successful intervention. And so you're going to get a little bit of practice on, okay, well, how, given what we've been talking about, and then that out of the box thinking with healthy food, we can't just make healthy food cheaper. There has to be more to it than that. And so what are those successful interventions? And you're going to get a chance to develop your own successful intervention this week. Okay. Some of the things that have proven to be really successful is adding the calorie count to foods. This says in New York because, again, studies are always older and then we evaluate studies. But now most restaurants, they need to add the calorie counts to all their foods. And you tell me, do you think it helps? I know it helps me. I all of a sudden, even though I generally eat a healthy diet, when I'm thinking of going a little off the rails, and then I look at the menu item and I see that calorie count and I'm like, I don't want to go that far off the rails. That was all the food I needed in one day. And so what we've actually seen is it will change how people will order food, and they will actually eat less calories because they're actually just telling themselves the truth about how many calories they're eating. Same with the ban on trans fats. This has been actually going for a while now. And then all trans fats has to be labeled in a nutrition label. And so as the result of that, we're seeing trans fats go down. Now, one of the next interesting things is, I don't know if you've looked at a food label lately, but we have a new food label, and now different vitamins are identified on a food label, the vitamins that we actually tend to be deficient in, like vitamin D, calcium, potassium. The other thing is now you'll see on all your food labels how many added grams of sugar are in your food. So now you can really differentiate, because every gram of added sugar is not needed. It's a rare day where we need an added sugar. The rare day really is kind of a baked good, like bread. Even your best whole grain bread, they typically will have 1 to 2 grams of sugar because it's part of the baking process. Past that, sugar is added to preserve food, to make food taste better, to make things sweeter, or to hide a lack of fat. And so hopefully what we will see as the result of that intervention down the road is people are consuming less sugar. When we look at different policies, price manipulation can be one of them. And then, so I want you to read about this, but read about ways that we can price manipulate in that the producers of the food can also remain successful. Okay. And then here are just some ones to look at that have had some successful outcomes with some of the preventative measures that they have taken. Okay, so I also want you to look at Baltimore Healthy Carryouts, because this was another study done that kind of shows how we can utilize policy, work with local community, and create things that are culturally sensitive and have that be effective measures. The one thing is, and I'll reiterate again, that when we do interventions, they have to be culturally appropriate, and we have to consider all people. And I know you might be looking at that saying, gender-specific messages, aren't we just moving away from that? Well, sometimes yes and sometimes no, right? But sometimes it is language. When someone says fresh versus healthy, well, fresh sounds exciting. Healthy sounds like, oh, does that mean it's going to taste like dirt, right? I went to a friend's house, and we're a plant-based household. We do eat some animal, but I usually bring salad to this event I go to. And he looked at me, he said, "Salad's what my food eats." And I thought about that, and I realized like the cultural impact that has had on him, because he's thinking, well, I don't eat vegetables, that's what my food eats, because I eat meat, right? So a change in language might entice someone like that to be more into eating a salad and not thinking about kind of in a cultural affront. So ultimately, your conclusion, you're going to go through your textbook. Obviously, this is a quick, fast, and dirty lecture, as they usually are. So we're going to be looking at our food environment. We're looking at our prepared environment and how that affects nutrition, and understanding the components of that prepared environment, and then looking at the research to show us what policies have been put in place, the benefits, and then kind of what we need to go from here to continue, because clearly we haven't solved the problem, and looking at prepared foods in the prepared environment.